The morning sun hung low over the iron gates of the Whitmore estate, casting long shadows across the cobblestone driveway where Rosa Martinez knelt with her worn bucket and frayed cloth. Her hands moved in practice circles against the metal bars, removing the dust that had settled overnight, her fingers calloused from years of similar work that had defined the landscape of her existence. She wore a faded blue dress that had seen better days, patched at the elbows and hem, the kind of garment that spoke of dignity maintained despite circumstances that constantly threatened to strip it away. Her graying hair was pulled back into a simple bun, revealing a face lined with the stories of sacrifice and endurance, eyes that still held warmth despite everything life had demanded of her. The Whitmore mansion loomed behind those gates like a monument to wealth and power, its white columns gleaming in the early light, its manicured lawns stretching endlessly toward horizons Rosa had cleaned but never truly inhabited. She had been coming to this gate for 3 months now, hired by the estate management company to maintain the entrance, a job that paid barely enough to cover her modest rent in the cramped apartment she shared with 2 other cleaning women on the opposite side of the city. It was honest work, she reminded herself each morning as she made the long journey by bus, honest work that hurt no one and allowed her to sleep at night with a clear conscience, which was more than could be said for many who possessed far greater material wealth. Rosa paused in her scrubbing to wipe her brow with the back of her hand, leaving a faint smudge of dirt across her temple. The morning was already growing warm, promising another scorching afternoon that would test the endurance of anyone working outdoors. She glanced toward the street where occasional cars passed, their occupants barely registering her presence, just another invisible worker maintaining the infrastructure of privilege that others enjoyed without thought or gratitude. This invisibility had become familiar to Rosa over the decades, a cloak she wore that sometimes felt protective and other times suffocating, depending on the particular cruelties or kindnesses any given day might bring. The sharp click of expensive heels against pavement announced a presence before Rosa saw her. She looked up to find a woman approaching the gate from the street side, her stride confident and purposeful, everything about her posture suggesting someone accustomed to having the world arrange itself according to her preferences. The woman was perhaps 30 years old, immaculately dressed in a cream-colored designer suit that probably cost more than Rosa earned in 6 months, her hair styled in perfect waves that caught the sunlight, her makeup applied with professional precision. Diamond earrings caught the light as she moved, and her handbag bore the unmistakable logo of a luxury brand that Rosa recognized only from advertisements glimpsed in magazines left behind on buses. Jessica Hartwell stopped directly in front of the gate, her eyes passing over Rosa with the kind of dismissive assessment one might give to a piece of furniture that happened to be slightly out of place. She reached for the gate handle, clearly expecting it to open, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently against the metal when she discovered it was locked. Her expression shifted from mild annoyance to irritation as she registered the obstacle to her intended passage. "Open this gate immediately," Jessica commanded, her voice sharp with the entitlement of someone who had never been denied anything she desired. "I have an appointment with Marcus Whitmore, and I'm already running late because of incompetent drivers who don't know the proper routes through this city." Rosa slowly rose to her feet, her knees protesting the movement after kneeling for the better part of an hour. She wiped her hands on her dress, a gesture that only seemed to increase Jessica's visible disgust, and spoke in a gentle voice that carried the soft accent of her homeland. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't have keys to the gate. I only clean it. You'll need to use the intercom system to contact the house. Someone inside can open it remotely." Jessica's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening in a way that suggested she was unaccustomed to receiving anything other than immediate compliance. "Don't be ridiculous. You work here. You must have access. Now open this gate before I report your obstruction to the estate management." "I truly don't have keys, ma'am," Rosa repeated, maintaining her calm despite the rising tension in the air. "I'm just the cleaning woman. The intercom is right there, mounted on the right side, if you press the button." "I don't take instructions from the help," Jessica snapped, her voice rising in volume. "Do you have any idea who I am? Do you understand the kind of connections I have in this city? I could have you fired with a single phone call. I could make sure you never work in any decent neighborhood again." Rosa felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with such confrontations, the weight of powerlessness that accompanied her station in life. She had endured similar moments countless times before, had learned to absorb insults and threats with a dignity that refused to crack even under the heaviest pressure. "I understand you're frustrated, ma'am, but I genuinely cannot open the gate. I don't have the means to do so. Please, just use the intercom and I'm sure someone will." The slap came without warning. Jessica's open palm connecting with Rosa's cheek with enough force to snap her head to the side and send her stumbling backward. The bucket tipped over, dirty water spreading across the cobblestones in a dark pool that reflected the morning sky. Rosa's hand flew to her face, shock and pain blooming in equal measure as she struggled to process what had just happened. The metallic taste of blood appeared in her mouth where her teeth had cut against the inside of her cheek. "That's what happens when you waste my time with your pathetic excuses," Jessica hissed, her face flushed with rage that seemed disproportionate to the situation at hand. "You people are all the same, lazy and incompetent, making up stories to avoid doing your jobs properly. Maybe that will teach you to show proper respect to your betters." Rosa stood frozen, her hand still pressed against her burning cheek, tears gathering in her eyes not from the physical pain, but from the profound humiliation of being struck like an animal in the street. She wanted to respond, wanted to defend herself, wanted to explain that she was a human being deserving of basic dignity regardless of her economic circumstances, but the words caught in her throat, tangled with years of similar indignities that had taught her that fighting back often only made things worse. A car had slowed on the street, its driver and passenger witnessing the assault, but they quickly accelerated away, unwilling to become involved in a scene that didn't concern them. Rosa felt the weight of that abandonment, the knowledge that her suffering was insufficient to inspire intervention from those who had the power to help, but chose comfort over justice. Jessica straightened her suit jacket, composing herself as though the violence she had just committed was nothing more than a minor inconvenience in her otherwise perfect morning. She pulled out her phone and jabbed at the screen, apparently deciding to call someone inside the mansion rather than use the intercom that had sparked the entire confrontation. As she waited for someone to answer, she glanced back at Rosa with an expression of pure contempt. "Clean up that mess you made," she ordered, gesturing toward the spilled water. "And consider yourself fortunate I don't have you arrested for obstruction and insubordination. In my world, people like you exist to serve people like me, and the sooner you accept that reality, the easier your pathetic little life will become." Rosa remained standing there long after Jessica disappeared through the gates that someone inside had finally opened, her hand still pressed against her burning cheek, watching as the woman's designer heels clicked their way up the long driveway toward the mansion's grand entrance. The morning had shifted somehow. The sunlight that had seemed gentle earlier now felt harsh and exposing, illuminating her humiliation for anyone who might pass by to witness. She bent slowly to retrieve her bucket, her movements careful and deliberate, as though sudden gestures might shatter whatever fragile composure she had managed to maintain. The dirty water had spread across the cobblestones in irregular patterns that almost resembled the maps of countries she had never visited, places that existed only in the dreams she had abandoned decades ago when survival became the sole occupation of her days. As she wrung out her cloth and began cleaning up the spilled water, Rosa's mind drifted backward through the years, carried by the peculiar current of pain that often brought memories flooding to the surface. She thought of the tiny village in the Philippines where she had been born, where poverty was not a source of shame but simply the shared condition of everyone she knew, where her mother had taught her that dignity lived not in possessions, but in how you treated others and how you carried yourself through the storms that life inevitably brought. Her mother had possessed almost nothing of material value, yet she had been the richest person Rosa had ever known, wealthy in kindness and grace, and the kind of wisdom that came from understanding that cruelty diminished the one who inflicted it far more than the one who received it. Rosa had left that village at 19, pregnant and unmarried, carrying Marcus in her womb and shame in her heart, shame that her mother had gently tried to remove by reminding her that a child was never a mistake, only a blessing that arrived on its own schedule rather than society's preferred timeline. The father had disappeared the moment he learned of the pregnancy, a young man from a neighboring village who had promised her everything and delivered nothing except the greatest gift she would ever receive, even if she couldn't see it as such during those early terrified months. She had traveled to the city first, then eventually across oceans to America, following the whispered promises of work and opportunity that drew thousands of women just like her, women willing to trade everything familiar for the chance to give their children something better than the circumstances into which they had been born. The early years in America had been brutal in ways Rosa had never imagined during those optimistic weeks when she first arrived. She worked as a domestic helper for families who treated her with varying degrees of kindness or cruelty, living in small rooms attached to large houses, raising other people's children, while her own son grew up in the care of whoever she could find and afford. Marcus had been such a serious child, old beyond his years even as a toddler, as though he understood somehow that their circumstances required him to be less trouble than other children, to demand less and appreciate more. She remembered nights when she would return from 12-hour shifts cleaning houses or caring for elderly patients, exhausted to the point of tears, and find him waiting patiently with drawings he had made, pictures of houses and families and dreams that existed only in his imagination. Education became her obsession, the singular focus around which she organized every decision and sacrifice. Rosa worked multiple jobs simultaneously, sleeping only 4 or 5 hours a night, eating the cheapest food she could find, wearing clothes until they literally fell apart, all so that Marcus could attend decent schools and have the books and supplies he needed. She tutored him herself in the evenings, despite her own limited formal education, instilling in him the belief that knowledge was the only true path to freedom, that his mind was the one possession no one could ever take from him, regardless of their prejudices or his circumstances. When he showed aptitude for mathematics and science, she found ways to enroll him in after-school programs, scholarships and community resources that she pursued with the determination of someone fighting for survival itself. The teenage years had tested them both in ways that still made Rosa's heart ache when she allowed herself to remember. Marcus had grown increasingly aware of their poverty, of how different their life was from the lives of his classmates, of the sacrifices his mother made daily while other parents seemed to provide for their children without visible effort or strain. He had wanted to quit school and work to help support them, an offer that Rosa had refused with a fierceness that surprised them both, insisting that his education was not negotiable, that she had not sacrificed everything only to watch him settle for the same limited options that had defined her own life. They had argued, sometimes bitterly, Marcus insisting he was old enough to share the burden, Rosa adamant that childhood should contain at least some elements of hope and possibility, rather than merely being a smaller version of adult struggle. But Marcus had inherited his mother's determination along with her sense of responsibility. He had excelled academically despite everything, graduating at the top of his high school class and earning a full scholarship to a prestigious university where he studied business and finance. Rosa had wept at his graduation, surrounded by families who had multiple members attending, parents who had degrees themselves and understood the academic world in ways she never could, yet she had been the proudest person in that auditorium, knowing that every diploma Marcus earned represented not just his intelligence but her faith in him, her refusal to let circumstances define his potential. He had gone on to build a business empire that still seemed impossible to Rosa whenever she tried to comprehend its scope, buying and selling properties, making investments that generated wealth in amounts that bore no relationship to the actual labor involved, existing in a world so far removed from her own experience that sometimes she wondered if they still inhabited the same reality. Marcus had begged her to stop working years ago, had bought her a beautiful house that she had refused, insisting she only needed her small apartment, had tried to give her money that she accepted only reluctantly and in amounts far smaller than he wished to provide. She continued to work not because she needed the income, but because work had become her identity, because she genuinely didn't know how to exist without it, because idle hands felt like a betrayal of all those years when every moment had to be productive just to survive. More than that, she feared becoming like the wealthy people she had served for decades, people who had forgotten what it meant to labor with your hands and sweat for your bread, people who treated workers like Jessica had just treated her, as though economic circumstances conveyed fundamental differences in human worth. The irony was not lost on Rosa as she finished cleaning the cobblestones and prepared to continue her work. Somewhere inside that massive mansion, Jessica was probably meeting with Marcus right now, perhaps discussing business or perhaps pursuing the romantic interest that Rosa had observed developing over recent weeks. Marcus had mentioned Jessica several times, always with a tone that suggested attraction and interest, describing her beauty and intelligence and ambition. He didn't know, couldn't possibly know, that the woman he admired had just struck his mother in the street like she was nothing more than an obstacle to be removed through violence. Rosa chose not to tell Marcus about the incident at the gate, a decision she made while riding the bus home that evening, her cheek still tender beneath the makeup she had carefully applied to hide the bruising that had begun to appear by midday. She sat near the back, watching the city slide past through smudged windows, the neighborhoods transforming from wealthy to working class as the bus carried her away from the world of mansions and manicured lawns toward the modest apartment building she called home. To tell Marcus would be to burden him with a choice between the woman he was falling for and his mother, to force him into a position where he would feel obligated to defend her honor at the cost of his own happiness, and Rosa had spent too many years sacrificing for his future to sabotage it now over her own wounded pride. The weeks that followed brought a subtle but unmistakable shift in Marcus's demeanor whenever he called or visited. His voice carried a lightness Rosa hadn't heard since he was a child discovering something wonderful and unexpected, that particular quality of joy that comes when the world suddenly reveals possibilities previously unimagined. He spoke of Jessica with increasing frequency and warmth, describing dinners at exclusive restaurants where she navigated the social dynamics with effortless grace, charity events where she introduced him to influential people who could expand his business network, weekend trips to her family's beach house where they watched sunsets and talked about futures that might include each other. Jessica was sophisticated and ambitious, he explained, someone who understood the world he now inhabited in ways that made him feel less alone in spaces where his humble origins sometimes still made him feel like an imposter despite his success. Rosa listened to these descriptions with a smile frozen on her face, nodding at appropriate moments, asking questions that any interested mother might pose, all while feeling a growing dread settle in her chest like a stone. She wanted to warn him, wanted to explain that the woman he saw at elegant dinners was not the same woman who had struck a cleaning lady in the street without provocation or remorse, that people often wore different faces depending on who was watching and what they hoped to gain. But how could she make such accusations without revealing the incident she had decided to keep hidden? And even if she did tell him, would he believe that his refined girlfriend was capable of such cruelty? Or would he think his mother was inventing stories out of jealousy or some desire to keep him tied to his past, rather than embracing his present? Marcus began bringing Jessica to family gatherings, small dinners at his penthouse where Rosa was always invited as the guest of honor, though Jessica's presence transformed these occasions into performances where everyone seemed to be playing roles rather than simply existing. Jessica would arrive dressed impeccably, bearing expensive wine or elaborate desserts from boutique bakeries, greeting Rosa with air kisses that landed nowhere near her cheeks and compliments that felt hollow and rehearsed. She would dominate conversations with stories about her own family, old money that had been carefully preserved and grown across generations, parents who summered in Europe and wintered in the Caribbean, siblings who held positions at prestigious firms and married into other prominent families. Throughout these monologues, she never asked Rosa about her own life or background, never expressed curiosity about the woman who had raised the man she claimed to care for, treating Rosa instead like an unavoidable fixture in Marcus's life that must be tolerated but need not be engaged with any genuine interest or respect. Rosa noticed how Jessica's behavior shifted depending on who was present. When Marcus was in the room, watching, Jessica would occasionally reach over to pat Rosa's hand or ask superficial questions about her day, performing a version of warmth that disappeared the moment Marcus's attention turned elsewhere. In those unguarded moments, Jessica's face would settle into an expression of barely concealed contempt, her eyes traveling over Rosa's modest clothing and worn hands, with the kind of assessment one might give to something broken that ought to be discarded. Once, when Marcus had stepped away to take a phone call, Jessica had leaned close to Rosa and whispered in a voice meant only for her, suggesting that Rosa might consider spending some of the allowance Marcus provided on better clothes, and perhaps some cosmetic procedures, since she was now associated with a man of Marcus's standing and really ought to look the part rather than embarrassing him with her appearance. The comment had landed like a physical blow, reopening wounds that Rosa thought had long since healed. She had said nothing in response, had simply excused herself to the bathroom where she stood staring at her reflection in Marcus's elegant mirror, seeing herself through Jessica's cruel eyes and feeling the weight of every year and sacrifice etched into her face. When she emerged, Jessica was laughing at something Marcus had said, her hand resting possessively on his arm, her performance of affection so convincing that Rosa found herself questioning her own perceptions. Perhaps she was being oversensitive, perhaps that slap at the gate had been an aberration born of stress or unusual circumstances. Perhaps Jessica truly did care for Marcus and her occasional coldness toward his mother was simply the awkwardness of someone from a very different background trying to navigate unfamiliar social territory. As months passed, Marcus began talking seriously about marriage, about how Jessica represented everything he had worked toward, a partner who matched his ambitions and understood the world he hoped to build. He spoke of merging their social circles and business interests, of children who would grow up with every advantage he had lacked, of finally belonging fully to the world of wealth and influence rather than forever feeling like a visitor who might be asked to leave at any moment. Rosa listened to these dreams and felt her heart breaking in ways she couldn't articulate, knowing that she was watching her son choose a life that would require him to distance himself from his origins, from her, from everything that had shaped him into the man he had become. She wondered if this was simply the price of success, if children who climbed out of poverty necessarily had to leave their parents behind in order to fully inhabit the new worlds they entered, if her sacrifice had always been intended to end with this particular kind of loss. Jessica's confidence grew as Marcus's commitment deepened. She began making plans for their future without consulting Rosa, deciding which holidays they would spend with which family, suggesting that Marcus might consider buying a new penthouse in a more prestigious building since his current address, while nice, wasn't quite suitable for the kind of entertaining they would need to do as a couple. She spoke about these decisions in Rosa's presence, not seeking her opinion but simply announcing them as established facts, making clear that Rosa's role in Marcus's life would be increasingly marginal once Jessica became his wife. The invitation arrived on thick cream paper with gold-embossed lettering, announcing Marcus's 5th business anniversary celebration at the Whitmore estate, the very mansion whose gates Rosa had been cleaning on that terrible morning months ago. Marcus had purchased the property himself 6 months earlier, transforming it from a place where she had worked as invisible help into his own statement of achievement, and he wanted to celebrate this milestone with everyone who mattered in his life. Rosa held the invitation in her trembling hands, reading the elegant script that listed her name among the honored guests, knowing that Jessica had certainly fought against her inclusion, but that Marcus had insisted, as he always did, that his mother belonged at every significant moment of his journey. The evening of the celebration arrived cloaked in the golden light of late autumn, the air crisp with the promise of coming winter. The Whitmore estate transformed into something magical, with thousands of tiny lights strung through the trees and along the pathways leading to the main house. Rosa stood before her modest closet for nearly an hour, sorting through the handful of decent dresses she owned, finally settling on a simple navy blue dress that Marcus had bought her 2 Christmases ago, one of the few gifts she had accepted, because refusing it would have hurt him more than her pride was worth protecting. She styled her graying hair as best she could, applied the minimal makeup she owned with careful hands that still remembered the bruise Jessica's slap had left, and studied her reflection with the resigned knowledge that she would never belong in the world she was about to enter, no matter how carefully she prepared. The taxi ride to the estate felt simultaneously endless and far too short, Rosa's anxiety building with each passing mile, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she rehearsed the smile she would wear and the gracious responses she would give to people who would inevitably ask how she was connected to Marcus, forcing her to explain her role as his mother to guests who would struggle to reconcile her obvious poverty with his evident wealth. The driver pulled up to those same iron gates where she had once knelt with her bucket and cloth, except now they stood open in welcome, flanked by valets in crisp uniforms who directed an endless stream of expensive cars toward the circular drive where guests emerged in gowns and tuxedos that cost more than Rosa earned in a year. She paid the taxi driver with bills she had carefully counted out earlier, leaving a tip that was probably too generous given her limited resources, but feeling somehow that arriving in a taxi rather than a private car already marked her as lesser, and she couldn't bear to add cheapness to the list of her visible shortcomings. A valet approached with a professional smile that flickered only slightly when he registered her modest dress and worn shoes, gesturing toward the entrance where music and laughter spilled out into the evening air. Rosa climbed the steps she had once watched Jessica ascend, each footfall feeling like a small act of courage, reminding herself that she had survived far worse than a party full of strangers who might judge her, that her worth was not determined by their opinions or their wealth. The interior of the mansion took her breath away despite her determination to remain unimpressed. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows revealed gardens illuminated like scenes from a fairy tale. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne and delicacies Rosa couldn't name, while a string quartet played classical music from a corner of the vast living room, where guests mingled in clusters defined by wealth and influence. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter simply to have something to hold, somewhere to direct her nervous hands, and began navigating the edges of the room, searching for Marcus among the sea of unfamiliar faces. She found him near the grand staircase, surrounded by well-dressed guests who laughed at his stories and competed for his attention, and beside him, radiant in a silver gown that caught the light with every movement, stood Jessica. Rosa's breath caught in her throat as their eyes met across the room, watching recognition and then shock register on Jessica's face, followed immediately by something darker and more calculating. Jessica's hand tightened on Marcus's arm, her perfectly painted smile never wavering even as her eyes promised retribution for this unexpected intrusion into her carefully constructed world. Marcus spotted his mother, and his entire face transformed with genuine joy, breaking away from his admirers to cross the room with arms extended, pulling Rosa into an embrace that conveyed all the love and pride and gratitude he sometimes struggled to express in words. He held her at arm's length, admiring her dress, telling her how beautiful she looked, introducing her to nearby guests as the woman who had made everything he had achieved possible, his voice carrying such warmth and respect that Rosa felt tears threatening despite her determination to remain composed. Several guests offered polite congratulations, their eyes traveling between Marcus and Rosa with barely concealed curiosity, clearly trying to reconcile the obvious disparity in their circumstances and presentation. Jessica approached with measured steps, her smile fixed in place like a mask that might crack if subjected to too much pressure. She greeted Rosa with air kisses that once again landed nowhere near her cheeks, her voice honey-sweet as she expressed surprise and delight at seeing Marcus's mother at the celebration, though her eyes communicated an entirely different message. She linked her arm through Marcus's in a gesture that was simultaneously affectionate and possessive, steering the conversation toward upcoming business ventures and away from any topics that might invite Rosa to participate meaningfully. Throughout the exchange, Jessica's free hand kept drifting to her throat, where an enormous diamond necklace rested, a nervous gesture that suggested she was not as composed as she appeared, that Rosa's presence had disrupted whatever narrative Jessica had constructed about Marcus's past and family. The dinner announcement saved Rosa from further awkward conversation, guests moving toward the formal dining room where a massive table had been set with china and crystal that reflected the chandelier light like captured stars. Rosa's heart sank when she saw the place cards, realizing she would be seated far from Marcus, relegated to the end of the table among people she didn't know, while Jessica would naturally occupy the seat of honor beside him. But as she approached her assigned chair, Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the room, insisting that his mother sit beside him, that the place of honor belonged to the woman who had sacrificed everything for his success. Jessica's carefully constructed facade began to crumble as Marcus physically rearranged the seating, moving Rosa to the chair immediately beside his own, while Jessica was forced to shift one seat over, no longer occupying the central position she had assumed was hers by right. The other guests watched this small drama unfold with the kind of intense interest people reserve for moments when social hierarchies are suddenly challenged or rearranged, sensing that something significant was occurring even if they couldn't fully understand its implications. Rosa took her new seat with quiet dignity, murmuring thanks to her son while avoiding Jessica's gaze, which had turned sharp and cold, all pretense of warmth evaporating as her carefully planned evening spiraled beyond her control. Throughout the elaborate dinner that followed, Jessica's behavior deteriorated in ways that would have been imperceptible to strangers but were painfully obvious to Rosa, who had spent months observing the younger woman's dual nature. Jessica drank more wine than was wise, her voice growing louder with each glass, her laughter taking on a brittle quality that suggested hysteria lurking beneath the surface. She began making comments that walked the razor's edge between humor and cruelty, observations about how difficult it must be for some people to adjust to wealth after lives of poverty, how breeding and education created instincts that couldn't be learned no matter how much money one acquired, how important it was to remember where one came from while also recognizing when it was time to leave certain aspects of the past behind for the sake of future advancement. Marcus initially missed these barbed remarks, distracted by his hosting duties and the endless stream of guests approaching to offer congratulations and discuss business opportunities. But Rosa heard every word, felt each verbal knife slide between her ribs with practiced precision, understood that Jessica was retaliating for her presence in the only way currently available, using language as a weapon in a setting where physical violence would be impossible. Rosa remained silent, eating little despite the extraordinary food placed before her, responding with minimal words when addressed, trying to make herself as small and unobtrusive as possible, hoping that her invisibility might defuse whatever escalating tension she could feel building around the table. The breaking point came during dessert, when one of Marcus's business associates asked how he had managed to build his empire so quickly, what advantages or connections had given him his initial foothold in such a competitive field. Marcus began to answer, starting to describe his education and early career moves, when Jessica interrupted with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass, her hand waving dismissively as though clearing away smoke. She announced to the table that everyone knew Marcus was essentially self-made, that he had come from nothing and nowhere, that his mother had been a domestic worker who cleaned other people's houses, and while that was certainly admirable in its own way, it was also why he needed someone like Jessica, someone with proper family connections and social training, to help him navigate the world he now inhabited and avoid the embarrassing mistakes that people from his background inevitably made without proper guidance. The table fell silent, the kind of profound quiet that follows truly shocking breaches of social etiquette, guests freezing with forks halfway to mouths, uncertain how to respond to such naked cruelty disguised as compliment. Marcus's face transformed, confusion giving way to understanding and then to anger as he processed what Jessica had just said, and more importantly, the contempt underlying her words. He turned slowly to look at his mother, seeing for the first time the pain she had been hiding throughout the evening, the trembling in her hands that held her napkin, the tears gathering in her eyes despite her determination not to cry, and something shifted in his expression, a door closing on whatever affection or possibility he had felt for the woman beside him. Rosa found her voice then, speaking into the silence with a steadiness that surprised even herself, telling Marcus that it was fine, that Jessica hadn't said anything untrue, that she had indeed been a domestic worker, and there was no shame in honest labor regardless of how others might perceive it. But Marcus shook his head, reaching for his mother's hand, his own voice tight with emotion as he addressed the table and particularly Jessica, explaining that his mother hadn't just been a domestic worker but had been 3 and sometimes 4 domestic workers simultaneously, laboring 18-hour days so that he could have books and education, going without food so he could eat properly, wearing the same worn clothes for years so he could have decent clothing for school, sacrificing every comfort and dream and possibility for herself so that he might have chances she never did. He stood then, still holding Rosa's hand, his voice rising as months and years of observations suddenly crystallized into understanding, pieces of a puzzle assembling themselves into a picture he should have seen earlier. He described finding his mother exhausted to the point of collapse, remembered her falling asleep during their evening study sessions because she had worked double shifts, recalled the way she would smile through obvious pain because she never wanted him to feel that his existence was a burden despite the immense cost it carried. And then, his voice dropping to something dangerous and quiet, Marcus turned to Jessica and asked a single question that seemed to detonate in the silence of the dining room. Had she ever encountered his mother before tonight, and if so, where and under what circumstances? Jessica's face cycled through expressions too quickly to catalogue, landing finally on defiance mixed with desperation, insisting that she had no idea what he was talking about, that she had never met his mother before this evening. But Rosa, finding courage she hadn't known she still possessed, spoke up then, her voice soft but clear, describing that morning at the gates, the slap that had left her cheek bruised for days, the contempt and cruelty that Jessica had displayed toward someone she perceived as powerless and therefore unworthy of basic human dignity. She hadn't wanted to tell Marcus because she knew he cared for Jessica, and she had no desire to interfere with his happiness, but she would not sit silently while being insulted at her own son's table, would not allow her sacrifice and labor to be treated as sources of shame rather than the acts of love they had always been. The exodus was swift after that revelation, Jessica gathering her belongings with shaking hands and fleeing the mansion while guests made polite excuses and departed far earlier than originally planned, leaving Marcus and Rosa alone in the enormous dining room surrounded by half-eaten desserts and champagne glasses catching the chandelier light. Marcus wept then, actually wept, apologizing for his blindness, for allowing someone who treated his mother with such cruelty into their lives, for almost choosing status and social acceptance over the values Rosa had worked so hard to instill in him. Rosa held her son as she had when he was small, stroking his hair and telling him that love often made people blind, that youth naturally sought belonging and acceptance, that there was no permanent damage done and life would provide other opportunities for happiness built on foundations more solid than wealth and social position. The months that followed brought changes that felt like returning home after a long journey through foreign lands. Marcus threw himself into philanthropic work, establishing scholarships for children of domestic workers and immigrants, creating programs that provided education and opportunity to those trapped in cycles of poverty, similar to what he and Rosa had experienced. He met Elena at one of these programs, a social worker whose own background echoed his, whose mother had also sacrificed everything so her daughter might have chances she never did, and their connection was immediate and profound, built on shared understanding rather than social performance. Their wedding was small and simple, held not in a mansion but in the community center where Marcus's scholarship program operated, attended by people who measured wealth in kindness rather than currency, and Rosa wept tears of genuine joy as she watched her son marry someone who saw him clearly, and loved not despite his humble origins but in part because of them, because they had shaped him into someone capable of empathy and gratitude and genuine connection. Jessica disappeared from their lives entirely after that disastrous anniversary dinner, though Rosa occasionally heard through mutual acquaintances that she had moved to another city, that her family's money had cushioned her fall but not restored her reputation, that she remained beautiful and ambitious but increasingly isolated, unable to understand why doors that had once opened easily now remained closed. Rosa felt no satisfaction in this news, only a distant sadness for someone who had possessed so many advantages yet had learned nothing about what actually mattered, who had mistaken cruelty for strength and contempt for superiority, who would likely spend her entire life surrounded by luxury, yet never experienced the richness that came from genuine human connection built on mutual respect and shared struggle. Rosa eventually retired from cleaning work, not because Marcus insisted, but because her body finally demanded rest after decades of relentless labor. She spent her days volunteering at the community center, mentoring other immigrant mothers, sharing the hard-won wisdom that had carried her through the darkest times. She lived simply still, in an apartment only slightly larger than her previous one, taking joy in small things like morning coffee and afternoon walks, and the sound of children playing in nearby parks. Marcus and Elena brought her first grandchild to meet her on a spring morning when light filled the world with impossible sweetness, placing the baby in her worn hands, and Rosa understood in that moment that every sacrifice had been worth it, that the love she had poured into her son had multiplied and would continue multiplying through generations, that dignity and kindness and sacrifice were the only true inheritances that mattered, the only wealth that actually enriched the world.